Archbishop Justin, tell us about what prayer means.
Prayer is simply the point at which consciously, sometimes unconsciously, but normally consciously, you engage with God. And two things happen, it seems to me, in my experience. First of all, there's a corrective influence. You are drawn into his love and you find your world is getting ordered. And secondly, in some extraordinary way, there are moments when, as you pray and seek, you find in partnership with God in his grace, he reaches out to you and says, work with me, we're going to change the world. It's an extraordinary thing. It's like an adult reaching to a child. And it is the most wonderful moment.
Well, this is a wonderful privilege for all of us to have an hour and a half in the company of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Thank you so much for turning out and joining us. The Archbishop and I are going to have a private conversation for about 45 minutes, so you can talk amongst yourselves for a while. And it would be rude of you to intrude, of course. And then for the last 40 minutes or so, you all get a go, and there will be microphones going around. I'm sure you'll all understand, not everybody will get a chance. If I see somebody who's asked questions at a lot of the previous lectures, they may not be favoured with the first opportunity in order to let everyone get a go. And if you talk for more than about 30 seconds, I'll interrupt you to make sure, again, that everybody else gets a go. Not personal, just a chance for everybody to have a chance to enjoy this evening. The Archbishop of Canterbury needs no introduction, but I'm going to ask him to stand and answer a few questions. Archbishop Justin, thanks so much for joining us. The theme of tonight is encountering God. Can you tell us about a time when God has met you?
It's fair to say that that first question I'd been warned about, but not the others really. So I'm still, and I've been thinking hard about what the answer was going to be, and as you can tell from the fact I'm blathering at the beginning of the answer, I still can't make up my mind. But I think I'm going to talk about a particular moment with, some years ago, long time ago, about 2006. I'd been invited to a conference in Switzerland where my spiritual director at where he was a monk in his community. And when I got there, there was a Vietnamese man dressed as clearly a Roman Catholic priest. And a bit louder. Is that better? Thank you. I've got a cold, so it's going to wear off, but there we are. A Vietnamese man who I met, and a Roman Catholic priest, turned out to be a cardinal. I'd never met one of those before, so I was a bit worried. And he and my spiritual director before the conference began, I just sat with them as they talked about prayer. And this man was called Antoine. He'd spent 13 years in prison, 9 in solitary. He'd been tortured under the communists after the fall of what used to be called Saigon. And they talked about prayer not as we often talk about it in a slightly mechanical way, but in terms of relationship with God. And it was one, without really being involved in the conversation at all, it was one of the most profoundly life-changing conversations, because somehow in the middle of their conversation, Jesus was brought into the midst of us. And there was a sense of his presence, of encountering him, of being challenged to the reality of the relationship that these two had with him, that set my life in a different direction, really. Is that a beginning of an answer?
It's the beginning of an answer. I want to ask you a little bit about how that felt. People in the Bible give all sorts of descriptions of fear. John Wesley talked about having his heart strangely warmed. How did it feel that Jesus was among you?
It felt like being loved. Yes, I mean, it's quite right that there are moments when we're fearful when we encounter God. God is not cosy and comfortable, but on this occasion, and it was the right thing, God meets us as we should be met. And on this occasion, it felt like being encountered by a profound sense of welcome and love.
And if it's not too personal, have you had that experience in what seemed to be a merely human connection, such that you recognised it when it happened in this situation?
Well, it was a fairly merely human connection, and I think one of there have been other moments, I think just in normal ways, sort of every day, the moments when you're part of a community which is functional in the sense not of being without its flaws and failings, but but functional in the sense of caring for and enduring one another sometimes, as well as enjoying one another at others. So, for instance, at Lambeth we have this wonderful community which Sam, actually, I always claim, was the person who sparked the idea in a conversation 6 years ago, almost, when you were helping me put away books when we moved in. And that community has now been going for 4 years. And there are many moments with it in just a very normal way, in which going to an office or being with them, there is a sense of the presence of God, that in their working away at their differences and their struggles with one another, you recognise the work of God and you are drawn into it.
Now, when you talked about that first encounter, there were 3 of you present, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, do you feel yourself more the intimacy of the encounter with God in that kind of smaller, more intimate human setting? Would you say that your experience of being with God is intensified because you spend a lot of time in large gatherings like this? I'm not saying it's not possible to find God in a place like this, but your first example was of an intimate setting.
No, I don't think there's any precondition in terms of there are ways that it's perhaps easier for certain personalities. But I'm thinking through, there have been moments of encounter with God when completely alone, usually in a place of which is, as they say in the Celtic tradition, a thin place. There have been moments there, particularly around silence and before the sacrament, that have been very profound. So that again is intimate and alone, or with perhaps one other person. But I think there have been moments also at the other extreme of, I'm sorry to say that in a place like this, you do forgive me, I'm willing to leave now, but I used to go to Holy Trinity Brumpton. And
is that a church, or is that...
Well, it's no more of a church than this is, Sam. Okay, gloves off. There have been moments now, which are not quiet and not alone, where a large group of people, in one way or another, engaged in an expectational encounter with God, has a profound effect on one's own expectations, one's own experience of meeting God and hearing a call.
How much do you think of either your or other people's sense of encountering God does depend on expectation? Is there a sense that if you go to an act of worship expecting God to show up, if you kneel to pray yearning for God to change things in your life or in the world around us, if you actually have that expectation, then that expectation is more likely to be fulfilled. Is that fair?
No, I don't think it is. I think expectation is good, but it is not essential, because God's so much bigger than that. I mean, the Bible stories of God meeting Ezekiel, of God meeting Hannah at the beginning of 1 Samuel, those are of God meeting Ruth in that beautiful story where there's no sense except in what happens that they've met God. They just look back and realise they've met God. Expectation is not necessary. And expectation can be so generated from within us that it becomes utterly misleading. We can end up saying, unless I feel like that, or unless I'm in a particular mood, I'm not going to meet God. Or unless I've got this particularly well-shaped God expectation in my life on a particular occasion. Another time I remember when I was working at Coventry Cathedral in the reconciliation field, and I'd been on a very difficult trip abroad. I'd flown back overnight. It had been difficult. There'd been some people killed. I'd had a very complicated time. I was really stressed, and I'd promised to go and speak at something at a church overseas, and I had simply to change planes and go. And I really didn't want to. I was in a really bad mood about it. I was exhausted. I just wanted to go home. And I arrived late in the evening, and it was a very sort of religious place. It was another monastery. And I thought, well, out of sheer pride, I put my things down in my room, and I thought, I will go down to the chapel to show people how spiritual I am. I'm not quite sure I put it quite that way to myself. It was a sort of sense of duty. I thought, with any luck, I'll stay awake for long enough, 10 minutes, and then I can escape back to my room and do what I really want to do, which is go to sleep. And I went down, and the chapel was warm, which would normally, in terms of falling asleep, I'm good at it. You know, when you say that, some of you, if you say the Psalms and you pause in the middle of a verse, I have been known to fall asleep during that pause. That is quick off the mark. I've certainly been known to fall asleep in the off verse if you're doing alternate verses, several times. Then someone has to cough meaningfully in the community to get me to go on. So to go into a warm room when I hadn't slept for ages was absolutely fatal. But the moment I went in, completely out of the blue, in a bad mood and just totally unexpected, there was God was present, and there was again that encounter with love, which kept me there for over an hour awake before I went back to my room. So there was no expectancy, quite the reverse. There was a rather hope that God didn't do anything because I wanted to go to bed.
Now, you're a person who lives a very disciplined life. You get up early in the morning. You, as you've mentioned, sit before the Blessed Sacrament. You have a disciplined habit of keeping silence, and you attend worship when you're at Lambeth Palace, once, twice, maybe 3 times a day. These are all times when, in theory, God is present. When the bread is broken, when the wine is poured, God is with us. So could you talk about the difference between God being with us and us feeling that God is with us?
Feelings are a gift. Let's not despise feelings. But there can be months and months with no feeling at all. Years. I was very struck. I was reading some of Mother Teresa's writings a couple of years ago, whereas is well known now. She went for years and years and years with a profound feeling of the absence of God, which she did not allow to change the way she lived or her vocation and call. I was very challenged by that. Most of the time, at worship, even in my own private prayer time, I will find my mind has strayed to other things, good or bad, or that I'm fretting about what I'm going to do in the day or what I did the previous day and what an idiot I was, or that I've got cramp in my left foot and can I move suddenly without disturbing the entire silent prayer that's going on around me? And then discover, of course, everyone else was thinking the same thing because they also had cramp somewhere or were tired. Or I've, on one notable occasion, fallen off the prayer stool because, guess what, I fell asleep during the silence. I didn't quite fall off, I just rocked forward in what I hoped looked like a dramatic moment of inspired prayer. But everyone said, you're obviously tired this evening, so I'm not sure it quite worked. And that's, you have to trust that God, prayer is not about feeling, it is about acting on the assumption that God is faithful. So you listen, you talk, you reflect, you contemplate, you read the scripture, you try and keep your mind somewhere near what you're meant to be doing. And I will quite often say to God at the end of a time of prayer, look, you know me better than I do. That wasn't very good at all, but you are. So I'm just going to have to leave it there. And that's as much of a meeting as sometimes there is.
So,
in fact, often.
So why is God so difficult to know? Why is God so hidden? Is it simply our inability to perceive and see? Is there some game going on by which we have to prove something or be some kind of a person? Or are there some people that are just, feel God with them all the time and are in some beatific state, and people like yourself don't quite seem to get there? Why does God make it so difficult?
Why do you make it only one reason, and a binary one at that?
Because I want to know the answer.
Yeah, but you know it better than I do. I think I'd start by saying it's a complex of things, isn't it? Sometimes it's us. We're human. Yeah, we're what we are. We're very flawed people. Why does my mind move back to the stupid thing I did yesterday or last week? Because I did a stupid thing last week. And if I hadn't, it wouldn't do that. Why does my mind wander? Because I'm very human. But there's another side which is extraordinary, which is the space God gives us. And if God gives us space to be who we are and to grow up over time more into who we're called to be, then that space sometimes means God's quite a long way away. And in our emotions, in our feelings, in our sensing, that sense of distance isn't just to make us better. I'm terribly cautious about the old thing of the sort of veil of souls, and you go along and suffering makes you better. Sometimes it makes me better. I'm sure it has done at some point. But for most of us, suffering makes us grumpy and cross and unhappy and wanting someone to stop it happening. We're in a mess. The world is not tidy and calm and good. The world is full of really bad places and people and things, including ourselves. And God gives us space to grow. And space to grow is means that sometimes we feel we don't sense the presence of God. And that's space for us to continue to take the choice to be disciples.
So would you take the view, let's keep it about you, that in terms of your sense of being close to God, or God being close to you, would you say that has been more the case in times of plenty than times of scarcity and suffering in your life? Or would you say there have been times because you, as I'm sure everybody knows, that there have been times of profound suffering in your life, would you say you have felt particularly close to God at those times, or has part of the suffering been that you didn't?
Both.
I'm not getting away with any binaries tonight.
No. God is not binary, apart from anything else, as we know. I think both. I think both Caroline, my wife, and I would say that in the deepest period of suffering, there was the most intense grief after the death of one of our children. The most intense grief, and yet the greatest closeness to God. The greatest sense of the faithfulness of God. I'm not going to try and square that circle. That's just what happened. And what also happened was a year or so later, when another of our children was very ill, or it seemed to us to be very ill, probably objectively he wasn't, but given the closeness. Sorry, please excuse me. Given the closeness to the previous event, it felt bad. I just remember a real sense of the absence of God that second time round, and no closeness of God. and of comfort and strength, which is the closeness of God, coming from other people, and people particularly within the church praying for us and supporting us. But I don't remember that sense of confidence in the faithfulness and purpose of God. So both, and I can't explain that. And I don't think there's a right and wrong to it. I don't think we'd done something, there's no daft thing about you did something wrong the second time, or you were particularly holy the first time. Quite the reverse. I don't think it's anything like that. I don't understand it, and I don't try and peddle out trite and cheap explanations. But I know God was around both times, either through God's people or through that deep sense of confidence and faithfulness which was there the first time. And the result of those two was a combination of things that made me rather less judgmental about what people experience and go through.
And there are people, there's none here tonight, of course, but there are people who would say of what you just said, that of course in the face of tragedy we want there to be some kind of hope or silver lining, and of course in the face of life's ups and downs we want to find some meaning, and of course in the face of our location in history, somewhat after the dinosaurs and before who knows what big crunch is to come, we want to find some sense that we're involved in some way with eternity. And so of course we would invent a God to be the answer to all those question marks. What would you say to a person, of course there's no such person here tonight, but what would you say to a person who might be quite sceptical about the very notion of the things the experience or the interpretation of the experiences that you've given us?
I would say that I really understand that. It makes an awful lot of sense to me. And the only thing that upsets the process is the person of Jesus Christ, and especially the resurrection. And then the life of the church, which, the church is the most, in much of its history, is the most dreadful institution. It's cruel, it's divided, it's bullying, it's harassing, it's horrible. It undermines people, it piles guilt on people. And somehow out of each of these disastrous periods, which we've gone through and continue to go through worldwide, somehow the church still manages, in its life and action in some places, always, and in all places occasionally, to proclaim the love of God because of the living, risen reality of Jesus Christ in the world. That Jesus rose from the dead and sent his Spirit to equip the church. And so when you're in the depths of the most corrupt period of the papacy, who pops up but St. Francis? When the Roman Empire is collapsing and the church is in a state of equal collapse, who pops up but St. Benedict? And so on and so forth. It's the resurrection, it's the person of Jesus that calls me back away from skepticism to saying, if it was made up, it would be easier, because surely we'd make up something a bit less complicated, a bit less problematic, and that gave us a bit more space.
Well, you've talked about the church there, and a couple of weeks ago we had Richard Coles and Ben Oakrey here, and they had a bit of a fight. Richard stepped in to separate them, which was just as well. It was getting a bit lively. And Ben Oakrey was saying, that the institution has historically and today been more of an obstacle to encountering God than a conduit. And the Reverend Richard Coles was saying, oh, no. And here's some nice collects from the prayer book that make me feel close to God quite a lot, and I wouldn't have those without the beloved Church of England. Where would you line up on a debate like that?
That's not so much asked me to put my foot in my mouth as to stuff my foot halfway down my throat. Funnily enough, I was thinking about this yesterday. A thought process goes through my mind when I'm asked a question like that. It goes like this. That's a really dangerous question. I'd better not answer it completely honestly. Oh well, what the heck.
It's just between ourselves.
Absolutely, and the cameras aren't running. I was thinking this yesterday. We went to a wonderful church yesterday where I was preaching, not an Anglican church, independent church, and it was full of life, full of people. It was wonderful. I was so moved by what I saw and what I heard. And I thought, why do we have all this institutional stuff? But of course, it's an illusion to say we can do without that. Because the moment you get a crowd of people together, as the Acts of the Apostles tells us happened at Pentecost, and in the weeks and months that followed, the first thing they had to do was start some kind of institutional life so that people were treated fairly and selfishness and things were eliminated, and they were taught to queue so that everyone got the food at the right time and all these other things, really important spiritual things. There's a real spirituality of queuing. And out of that grows the need for oversight, which we call episcopacy, or bishops. And as one goes on, the charismatic and the institutional live together, and then the institutional overwhelms the charismatic, and then, in the grace of God, the charismatic bursts out again, because you can't contain it. And that's the life of the Spirit. But we always need some way of living an orderly, proper life. And finding the balance of that is an eternal struggle in which, by the grace of God, we are constantly challenged and kicked out of our little ruts into a more open way of acting. And I think that's one of the things that's happening in the Western Church at the moment, and it's very good news.
Would you say that Christians have a monopoly on encountering God? When you've met with religious leaders of other traditions, some of whom are in the exhibition downstairs, when you dialogue with them, do you say, yeah, I felt like that too? Or do you say, I very much respect your contribution to the world, but you have to understand that unless you pray through Jesus Christ our Lord, your prayers do not connect?
It would be a very small view of God that said that God could only operate, I know you're going to ask me that question later, that God could only operate through one way, through one sort of mechanistic way. But that doesn't mean that Jesus isn't crucial, sorry, double negative, but I believe that Jesus is still absolutely crucial to the whole revelation of God. It is through Jesus that God is revealed in the world as to who God is. If you want to know who God is, look at Jesus. But the idea that people in different countries, different cultures, different upbringings, different backgrounds, in their search for God, are ignored because they haven't pressed the right button is a caricature of the idea of the unique truth of Jesus Christ. And yes, I have met plenty of people who I listen to intently because their wisdom, their insight, their inspiration lifts me, challenges me, moves me on. And yet we have to be honest that we have very different understandings of who God is and how we meet God. How God meets us, how God reaches out to us. So, of course, God is at work in so many places and through so many people and extraordinary circumstances. And of course, I'm glad, I am the Archbishop of Canterbury, it goes with the job, really. I do hold to the unique and exclusive truth of Jesus Christ, yes. So basically both. So you've got a binary answer there.
And one contemporary theologian said that if you're feeling that God isn't happening for you, and you have that dry sense that you're not, that the Spirit isn't moving in you, go and find someone or some people for whom it is, and more likely than not, they'll be amongst the poorest people in your society. Would you agree and say that God is more to be expected, more often shows up amongst one class of people, particularly the poorest, or is it more random than that?
It's never random, ever. God doesn't do random. It is certainly amongst the poorest and the most oppressed that often one finds the clearest vision of the truth and reality of God. And I do in Canterbury Diocese, where I'm the bishop, a very absentee one, but I do go there from time to time. I go 1 year in Holy Week, I'll be in the cathedral doing lectures or interviews or reflections of some kind. And the other year I'll go into a deanery, a group of parishes around the diocese, and I was in one of those this year, last Easter, or the week before Easter. And I spent, it was an area of really serious deprivation. And on Maundy Thursday, there's a tradition that you probably do here of in the evening of washing people's feet. And there's a communion service, and you wash feet because it's what Jesus did. And when I'm at the cathedral, the feet have been prepared. You only get one foot to wash. The foot has been prepared so well that you could more or less eat your dinner off it without fear of infection. And this year I was in a little church on an estate where I guess there were 25 people. In the cathedral there's 1,000 or something. And there were 25 people, if that. There was I doubt half of them knew who the Archbishop of Canterbury was, and they probably didn't care. That was very healthy. And we explained, the person who led the church, that little gathering there, and I explained the story of the washing of the feet in John 13. And then I said, well, we're now going to wash some feet. Your feet, if you want them washed. And I rather expected no one would move. But actually most people did. And they were, a good proportion of the people there were sleeping rough. And it would be safe to say that probably eating your dinner off those feet might not have been entirely a good thing. But they came with such gentleness and normality, just being human. And I said at the beginning, I'll wash your feet, and then when I finish washing your feet and drying them, please would you just say a prayer for me? Put your hand on my head and just say a prayer. And that's what we'll do. And they did. And that was a moment of meeting Jesus in a way that was really extraordinary. And I thought, oh, I'm just getting emotional. I'm getting old and emotional the whole time nowadays. And except that when later this year, in the end of June, I happened to ordain the person who led that little community. And we were chatting before the ordination. He said, do you remember that Maundy Thursday service? And I said, I'll never forget it. It was extraordinary. It was so profound and moving. And he said, yes. I mean, the phrase he used, he said, God showed up. I've never known that sense of the presence of God. It was as though the air had got thicker. So, yes, I would say to you, yeah. And that was a surprise. You've
talked just now, and you talked earlier when we talked about the three figures at the beginning, and once in between about this wonderful description of the air thicker and being loved. Have you ever had an experience which you had to say that was God, but didn't feel good? There's many descriptions in the scriptures about the anger of God, or the wrath, if you want to give it a posh name. There are presumably God doesn't always have nice things to say.
No, absolutely. Last week, week ago today, I had a meeting which I handled really, really badly. And I was perfectly convinced of my right. And that, what I was arguing about was exactly the right thing. And when I was praying the next morning, there was such a sense that I'd done the wrong thing. It wasn't exactly anger, it was shame. And I went and wrote a letter to the person to say sorry. Probably won't make much difference, but I did. So that would be quite normal in my life, actually. I find, if I'm being really honest, it's probably another unwise moment, I find it much easier to believe in and understand the anger of God than the love of God. At least to experience it. But it's probably because I'm kicking myself too. I don't know, there's all kinds of things. But do you remember, Sam, when we went, was it 2.5, 3 years ago? 3 almost it must be, to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And do you remember that extraordinary Stations of the Cross around Birkenau? And that moment when we stood by the ash pits and the priest who was leading us in the stations, the meditations, was minus 16, minus 15, something like that.
A temperature?
Yeah.
At minus 18 at least. Yeah.
It was very cold. And snow on the ground. And it was in January. And the priest said, I'm not going to say very much here. I want you to listen to the cries of the earth. And we spent about 7 or 8 minutes in that cold listening. Now, what did you think there about what you experienced of God during those Stations of the Cross? And for me, that was the key moment. What would you say about the wrath and the encounter with God at that, during that experience? Or were you just cold?
No, I remember it just as you describe it, and I felt a shiver inside as well as outside. I actually felt something that I don't remember feeling at another time in my life, which is just a hint of a sense of what it was like for Christ to carry the sins of the world in his body on the cross. I felt in that shiver, I felt I was literally in touch with the earth and all that it had underneath us. Mm. And I felt that exactly what you're describing. I felt a shiver that wasn't my shiver. It was a shiver that had come, as the priest described, from the cries underneath us. It was a very profound, horrifying moment. I mean, it wasn't a nice experience, but it was the reason we went there.
Yeah, I go each year, try and go to somewhere with a group of clergy where there has been, or is, in one way or another, in different forms, immense evil. And that was one of them. And it was, I think you're right, that shiver, but also for me there was that sense of this, well, what you just said, this is what we mean when we say Christ bore the sins of the world.
Yes, it was a sense that I didn't do this, but I did really.
And you have Jewish ancestry.
Yeah.
They were your people, and some of them.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own experience. You as I mentioned, you keep a regular discipline of silent prayer, and many of us, when we were taught to pray, we were taught about the 4 letters A, C, T, and S: acclamation and confession and thanksgiving and supplication. But the way you've talked about God being with you, about that sense of love, it doesn't feel like the kind of experience you have after listing 15 sick relatives and a number of issues on your personal agenda that you feel are too big for you to handle yourself in the conventional intercessory way. Is your prayer, given all the things that you have to concern you, is the heart of your prayer adoration?
No. It'd be nice if it was. I think I'd be making more progress in prayer. No, the ACTS acronym, Adoration, Confession, Thanksgiving, Supplication, is one that I use every day. Because there's an awful lot of prayer which is just about doing it. Because if we're only going to pray when we have an encounter with God, we're not going to pray very much. And that means actually we probably won't meet God as much. We'll sort of shut out the opportunities. And so I go out every morning early and I go 5 times round the garden. And I pray the first circuit, or 3 on bad days, or 4 on really bad days, is all confession. And then I pray for the family, I pray for the people I work with, I pray in the third group for the places that I've served as a priest. And finally I pray for myself. And in each of those there'll be some thanksgiving, there'll be lament, there will be intercession, and there's quite a lot of list. But it seems to me that if you're going to pray, you've got to pray. And that's one of the ways in which I pray. And it's as valuable as any other way, because prayer isn't about just me, it's about the whole body of Christ. And then I go to morning prayer, where I'm using the set prayers. And then if it's a good day and I'm around, I go to the Eucharist, where again the liturgy is set. And then as this evening, the Book of Common Prayer in the evening at 5:30 with the community, where it's very set. And those are essential building blocks to the prayer, to other forms of prayer. They are all equally important. There's nothing wrong with lists. I mean, I keep lists because it helps me remind me who I'm meant to be praying for. There's nothing wrong with lists. God doesn't get bored easily, as far as we can tell. And so a list does no harm. It shows that you've remembered someone. And sometimes prayer is a sustained period of intercession. Sometimes it's a sustained period of adoration. And sometimes often it's a sustained period of a wandering mind.
Sometimes, I think this is going to be my last one, and then everybody else gets a go. Sometimes encountering God has been described as being enjoyed by God. Could you say something about what it means for God to enjoy us? Because most of the emphasis in encountering God is on what it's like for us.
Yeah, quite right.
What's it like for God?
There's that wonderful verse in the Old Testament, is it Zechariah? About God rejoicing over us with dancing and singing. God delighting in us. There's the whole Song of Songs, which has lots of different meanings, which we won't go into all of them. But
oh, go on.
No. We talk enough about sex in the church.
But never as if we actually enjoy it.
Speak for yourself.
I'm here to ask the questions, not to answer them.
You're beginning to sound like Andrew Marr last Sunday. I think it's one of the things it's a very good point, and I usually forget it. We have to remember that God did all that God does in order that we might relish Him, feast on God, and that He might feast with us. That wonderful verse in Revelation. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone opens the door, I will come in and eat with them. It's not a quick McDonald's. It's a 6-course meal with plenty of time and thought and pleasure and enjoyment. The God whom we love We love because God first reached out to us in undiluted love for the mere pleasure of our company. And when we remember that, it must change prayer rather decisively. So I will try and remember that.
I'd like us all to keep a minute of silence in which your thoughts may go as they wish. They may be prayer, they may be thinking of a question you'd like to ask the Archbishop. We'll just be silent together for a minute, and I'll tell you when the minute's over, and then there will be people walking around with microphones.
I love that question about identity and certainty. I think that's really helpful. It's opened up all kinds of thoughts. Thank you. I would certainly agree that one can't specify this is how God shows up. That's absurd. God's God. But a genuine experience of God has an impact on the unfolding, the unveiling of one's identity, and an impact on the confidence in one's call and direction, which I'm too Anglican to talk about certainty in that context, I think. But I would certainly say that one of the revelations for me was a few years ago when it turned out my father wasn't my father. Some of you may remember that in the press. It will have happened to lots of other people. And we were sitting trying to work out, just before the article was published, about trying to work out what I was going to say to the press, because we thought they might be interested, which indeed they were. It got them off Brexit for a whole 3 days. And they said, and I just said, well, for me, it was a moment of revelation. I said, for me, my identity isn't DNA, it's in Jesus Christ. And the communications, the press secretary said, that's the line, that's it. And I think that came out of what you were talking about, that sense of encounter, that God knows who I am, even if I don't, which I clearly didn't. For 59 years or 60 years, whatever it was. So thank you for the question, but I think you're absolutely right. One of the impacts of prayer is on our sense of identity in God and on the certainty not of the existence of God, but certainty of our vocation in God, I think. Second question, thank you very much, sir. No, I haven't. I've always been known by God, but I didn't always know God to any extent. Like most people, I went through years of compulsory religion in one form or another, and it didn't have much impact. And it was really, for me, the revelation that I was loved by God, that God could be known rather than merely believed in as an entity in some distant place, was when I was working in Kenya in 1974 and met people who clearly had that walk with God, in one case shown especially by forgiveness. And that began a process which led to me opening, or use traditional evangelical life language, which is what I think happened, of offering my life to God, of opening my life up to God. So that was when I was 19. So I hope that answers the question. And that was I'm sure God had been working in my life before that, but I didn't know. Oh, when I get cross with them. That was a joke, for the record. I've discovered with a lot of people it's quite important to say that. How do I work out? Well, certain times, I mean, to put it bluntly, if someone dies, I give thanks for their life, but I probably won't go on praying for them very long. I pray for people who ask me to pray for them, but I pray regularly for those where there is some kind of known link. And I will continue to pray for them till either it's clear that something has changed, that the prayer is answered in some way, or a clear sense that it's time to stop. And I can't really explain the latter, and it doesn't happen very often. In fact, I can hardly remember it happening. But a lot of the prayer I pray for people is prayer for blessing. And with most people, their lives, we all make our lives sufficiently complicated that there's plenty of scope to pray for blessing in them. Oh, I'm glad they're all nice, simple questions. I don't think that Adam and Eve are not mentioned except in the first chapters of Genesis. And I don't, again, it comes back to my dislike of the binary either or. Why does it have to be either or? Why can it not be redemption and blessing? Or blessing and redemption? I think we narrow too often and too easily what we understand of God. The thing about theology, for me, which I started doing I'm no sort of theologian, certainly compared to Sam, but I started doing theology in my late 30s when I went back to university to train for ordination and did a theology degree, and I've been sort of doing it one way or another ever since. And I remember when I first started doing theology, it was probably the healthiest thing. It felt like standing on the edge of a new great ocean that one was unaware of. And there was this endless sea of knowledge, of understanding, of reflection, which seemed to stretch to all eternity, and I think probably does. And so when it comes to an understanding of redemption, it seems to me that the kind of thing I was talking about, the experience of places like Auschwitz, of Rwanda, places I've been over the last few years and seen terrible, terrible things, of places I've been to in the past, similarly, in this country and abroad. Redemption, a God who did not redeem, it would be it would be a God who condemned by failing to redeem. But a God who did not bless would equally be a God who seemed to have a really warped character. And so I would say it's both and, blessing and redemption. But we shouldn't forget redemption, because when I look inside myself, never mind anything else around me, I see plenty of things that need redeeming and forgiving and paying for. What a good question. I don't know. I suppose part of the thing is, unusually for me, I try and listen more than I speak when I meet people of other faiths. And I think it goes back to something, funny enough, that someone, when I was doing my theology degree, one of the professors said to me, he said, "You've always got to he was the person lecturing on interfaith. He said, you've got to go into every encounter being prepared to be persuaded by their view. And that means you go in with a deep sense of expectancy, of openness, of respect for them. And you listen and see what they say. And they're a human being, so you love them. And you may realise that they're a bit of a rascal from time to time. Or sometimes you realise they're not good people at all. But as Christians, we have plenty of those as well. So it comes out of the relationships, being human to another human. Yes.
Okay.
Infuriatingly, not predictably. You want me to say more than that, don't you? Well, wouldn't it be easy if you knew that if you said the prayer, God is not magic. It's not like Harry Potter. Go back to some of the early Harry Potter films, and they're trying to do spells where they levitate someone. You've got to get the pronunciation of the spell exactly right, or it doesn't work. That's not prayer.
That's why we have authorised liturgies, isn't it?
That's why we have yes, that's why we have HTV. And that was revenge. I'll have to repent of that as well. God, there isn't a magic formula. Does God intervene? Yes, he does. Yes, God intervenes amazingly. And I've seen things, and over the last 6 years, so many things where just the utterly, Temple, that famous expression of his, that when I pray, there are coincidences, and when I stop praying, there are fewer coincidences. Does God intervene? You bet God intervenes. Do we know exactly where, how, and when? Regrettably not. But we know God is faithful. Thank you, Duncan. It's a perfectly fair question. The problem is it's an imaginary world. And I'm going to answer as I think Sarah Mullally did a few weeks ago. My job in the real world in which I live, particularly at the moment, with the Lambeth Conference 18 months away, and with my own sense that it's not just what I think that matters, it's what the whole people of God thinks that matters. And none of us have the right simply to tell everyone else what to think. And I want to see, through profound reflection on Scripture, which for me is the final authority when interpreted rightly in matters of faith and practice, through deep thinking philosophically and theologically, through a clear-eyed study of the history and failings of the Church, and through a study of the biological and human sciences, how the Church emerges with a view. And so I'm not going to say what my answer will be in your imaginary world, because my job is not to do that. My job is to speak to a world of confusion, ill-treatment of LGBTIQ+ people, desperate ill-treatment in some countries, which I do oppose publicly and privately, and not to act in a way that just suits me and my place in this country at this time. And I mean me, I don't mean us. So I'm just not going to answer the question. I'm sorry, that's a bad answer. In daily life, it's the biggest struggle for me. I think I try and do certain things. There are certain places, which I reserve as points of prayer. So when I walk past them, it reminds me to pray. There are certain actions where I pray automatically. Meals. I mean, grace, it's an old-fashioned idea. But saying grace before a meal is a jolly good way of reminding yourself that God exists and that God got you the food, and why don't you just be thankful for it? And then you can get on. That keeps you in mind of God. And my spiritual director is always going on about this to me, and he says, just remember to keep telling Jesus you love him and thanking him that he loves you. He said, I do it the whole time. Well, I know he does, and it's really annoying because I don't. But I think that coming back to the heart of love that we find in Christ is what I'd say. I'm really moved by your question, and you have to write in terms of your own relationship. But I would say to someone, I've said that recently to someone, I love you. Nothing will stop me loving you, and missing you most terribly when you aren't with us. And I would say that I know you disagree with what I believe, but the reason I believe it is I believe Jesus rose from the dead to give us life, and that's open to us at any point. And I believe that he is love, and that love is what gives me a source of love, and that love is offered to you as comfort, as hope, as strength, as salvation. And I would talk of love. Now, I'm not very good at talking about. I've talked about the wrath of God, but to powerful and rich people who are about to do terrible things, but not to people who are facing their last days and weeks of love. I don't know if that's okay. On mental illness, what do we do to pray? I think the answer is yes. The experience of Ellie and Catherine has changed us enormously. And you just see the complexity of things. And you don't judge people. And it's the complexity of illness, and especially mental illness, not least because it's invisible, that gets me to love the church. Because I know when we can't pray, others can pray, and they hold us. And in the same way as if someone is injured and they're being carried, that's all right. So with mental illness, how do you pray? Use the Psalms if you can, and if you can't, get other people to do your praying for you. The Psalms have so much that reflects all the issues of mental illness and struggle and victimization and marginalization and cruelty and suffering, as well as joy. Look at Psalm 88. Which doesn't have a shred of hope in it. And it's easy to me when you read it, having lived with people suffering from depression, when you read Psalm 88, you think this person is exactly like the people we live with. It's a psalm of lament, of complaint. And it says to God, why are you leaving me in this terrible darkness? And then it stops without an answer. And so let other people pray, or if you can pray at all, use set prayers, because they just enable you to cope. I hope we're getting a bit better at not going down the other side. I seem to spend an awful lot of time, which I don't present at all, quite the reverse, sitting with people the church has done great damage to, or listening, or saying sorry, or feeling deeply ashamed. I think when we see these things, in many ways, the church today is doing less walking down the other side than it has done for many a long year, particularly in the last 10 years, with people who are suffering in our deeply unequal society, with the poor. The church is much more with the poor than it was, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And there's always been exceptions, but it just seems to be taken as normal nowadays. And also when the church goes horribly wrong, modern scrutiny quite rightly holds us to account, not just on abuse, but in so many other ways. And sometimes the scrutiny is unfair, but sometimes it's just fair and we have to put up with it and apologise. So I hope we're getting better, but I know we've got a long way to go. Yes and no, which is an Archbishop's way of saying no, really, and to parents. I grew up with a grandmother who'd grown up and spent her whole life in India and really knew an awful lot, heavily engaged with local people, spoke Hindi and Urdu, and had this huge love for and was deeply influenced by Hinduism, so many gods. But even within Hinduism, there is the underlying sense of the one, of oneness, of unity, as well as diversity. And I believe in one God because Jesus did. It's not very clever, but that's what Jesus said. And I think people's experiences of God are utterly diverse, and we explain that in lots of different ways, and sometimes by seeing God in lots of different ways. But I don't think it's necessarily wrong to take the revelation we've received of God as something that is pure and should not be used to oppress others, but is something to which we can witness with hope and with love and with gentleness. All human language is to some degree, all human language about God is inadequate and to some degree metaphorical. God is not a father in exactly the same way as a human being is a father. God is not male or female. God is not definable. It is extraordinarily important as Christians that we remember that the definitive revelation of who God is was not in words, but in the Word of God whom we call Jesus Christ. because you can't pin God down. God has made himself known. So was it for me to call God Father, having had a rather confusing experience of fathers? It means that here is one that is perfect, that loves me unconditionally, that reaches out to me and knows me better than I know myself, and yet still loves me profoundly, that loves me enough to make redemption and blessing possible and open, that offers me a way through life that can be very complicated and painful, and can be overwhelming and wonderful, but is always Father, is always the one who in love embraces, draws, heals, blesses, and will eventually call me to be present to God.
Thank you.
No fambana ye, no fambana ye, no fambana ye narini, no fambana